You're a disgrace to this family's legacy." Those words hit me like shrapnel as my stepfather Robert slammed my discharge papers across the dinner table, scattering my mother's good china. The sound echoed through the dining room like a gunshot, and for a moment, everything went silent, except for the ticking of his father's old military clock on the mantel. This is the story of how my stepfamily called me a failure at Sunday dinner, only to watch their world completely collapse 3 minutes later, when the Pentagon called me their general. If you've ever felt like an outsider in your own family, surrounded by people who were supposed to love you but never really accepted you, smash that subscribe button, because this story is going to show you that sometimes the people who underestimate us the most are the ones setting themselves up for the greatest fall. Before we start this story, tell me in the comments where you're watching from while I tell you who I really am. Because understanding my story means understanding how a hated stepson turned their own corruption against them. My name is Philip Morales. I'm 34 years old, and I come from two completely different worlds that collided when I was 12 years old. My biological father, Miguel Morales, was a decorated Marine who served 3 tours in Iraq. He came home with a Bronze Star, a Purple Heart, and stories about honor that shaped my entire worldview. He taught me that a man's worth isn't measured by what he has, but by what he's willing to sacrifice for others. He died in a car accident when I was 10, leaving my mother devastated and financially struggling. 2 years later, she married Robert Hancock. Robert was everything my father wasn't: wealthy, connected, smooth-talking. He owned a successful construction business and promised to give us the stability we'd lost. What he didn't promise, what became clear almost immediately, was that he'd never see me as anything more than baggage that came with my mother. The Hancock family had their own military legacy. Robert's father had been an Army officer. His older brother had served in Vietnam. Robert himself had avoided service through college deferments and then built his fortune while other men fought. But he loved to surround himself with military prestige, especially when it helped his business. Brandon was Robert's biological son, 2 years younger than me, and from day one, the golden child who could do no wrong. Where I was reminded constantly that I was a charity case, Brandon was groomed for greatness. Where I was expected to be grateful for scraps, Brandon was handed opportunities on a silver platter. The dynamic was toxic from the beginning. Robert would introduce Brandon as my son and me as my wife's boy. At family gatherings, Brandon got the spotlight while I got ignored. When report cards came home, Brandon's B's were celebrated while my A's were expected. But the cruelest part was how they weaponized my father's memory. Robert would tell me that my real father would be disappointed in my attitude, my performance, my very existence. He'd compare me unfavorably to Brandon, suggesting that military bloodlines meant something and that I clearly hadn't inherited whatever made my father special. My mother, caught between loyalty to her son and dependence on her husband, chose the path of least resistance. She stopped defending me, stopped fighting for me, eventually stopped seeing me as anything more than a source of family tension that needed to be managed. I learned early that in the Hancock household, I would always be an outsider looking in. So I did what outsiders do. I found my own path. The military became my escape route. At 18, I enlisted in the Marines, following my father's footsteps and finally finding a place where my last name didn't matter, where performance was the only currency that counted, and where I could build something that belonged to me alone. And I was exceptional at it. Everything that made me unwanted in the Hancock family. My independence, my refusal to accept their hierarchy, my hunger to prove myself, made me perfect for military service. I thrived under pressure. I excelled at leadership. I had a strategic mind that impressed every commanding officer I served under. Within 8 years, I'd made captain. Within 10, I was being recruited for special forces. My stepfamily watched my rise with a mixture of grudging respect and barely concealed resentment. I was succeeding in spite of them, not because of them, and that reality ate at them every day. Robert started claiming credit for straightening me out and teaching me discipline. Brandon began telling people that his influence had shaped my military career. My mother convinced herself that the stability Robert provided had been crucial to my success. They rewrote history to make themselves the heroes of my story, even as they continued treating me like a second-class family member. But here's what they never understood. Every slight, every dismissal, every reminder that I didn't belong had been forging me into something they couldn't control or contain. By the time I reached Force Reconnaissance, I wasn't just a Marine, I was a weapon. And weapons, as my biological father taught me, are only as dangerous as the person wielding them. Afghanistan, 2022. Operation Red Sand. I can't tell you all the details even now, but what I can say is this. We were tasked with a high-value target extraction that required the kind of strategic thinking and operational excellence that I'd been building my entire life. After the operation, I was discharged from the military and sent home in disgrace. I walked into the Hancock family home for what I thought would be a quiet conversation with my mother about my legal situation. Instead, I found the entire family gathered in the living room like a tribunal waiting to pass judgment. Robert was sitting in his leather armchair, the one he called the throne, with a newspaper folded to the article about my court-martial. The headline read, "Local Marine Captain Dishonorably Discharged After Afghan Disaster." Well, he said without looking up. The family hero returns. How does it feel to be front-page news, Philip? Though I suppose hero isn't the right word anymore, is it? My mother sat silently in the corner, her hands folded in her lap, staring at the floor. She wouldn't even look at me. "Sit down, Philip," Robert commanded, gesturing to the small wooden chair opposite his armchair. "We need to talk about your situation and how it affects this family." I remained standing. "My situation?" "Your disgrace," he corrected. "Your very public, very embarrassing disgrace that's now attached to the Hancock name. Do you have any idea what this is doing to my business? To Brandon's career? To your mother's reputation in the community?" "I told you he'd amount to nothing," Robert continued, his voice getting louder. 15 years I've tried to straighten you out, teach you discipline, show you what it means to be part of a respectable family. And this is how you repay us? By humiliating us in front of the entire city?" Brandon stood up and walked over to the mantel where Robert's fake military photos were displayed. "You know what's funny? All those years you acted like you were better than me because you were some hotshot Marine. Turns out you were just another screw-up who couldn't handle the pressure." Robert said, "You want to know what I told my business partners when they asked about you? I told them you were never really my son anyway, that you were just some charity case we took in out of pity for your mother. Turns out I was right." The words hit like physical blows, but I forced myself to remain expressionless. "And now," Robert continued, "now you're going to drag us all down with you. Do you think the Department of Defense wants to work with a company whose son is a disgraced Marine? Do you think Brandon's commanding officers want to promote someone whose stepbrother is a failure?" Brandon nodded eagerly. "I had to do damage control at the base today. Explain to everyone that you're just my stepbrother, not my real family, that your failures don't reflect on me." "That's enough?" my mother finally said, but her voice was weak, defeated. "No, it's not enough," Robert snapped. "He needs to understand the consequences of his actions. He needs to understand that his selfishness has consequences for all of us." He turned back to me, his face red with anger. "You're unemployable now, you know that? No security company will hire you. No law enforcement agency will touch you. You're damaged goods, Philip. A liability." "Maybe he can get a job at a fast food restaurant," Brandon said with a cruel laugh. "I hear they don't do background checks on dishonorably discharged Marines." Robert smiled at that. "Perfect, from Marine captain to burger flipper. That's quite a fall, isn't it, Philip?" My mother looked up at me then, and for a moment I thought she might defend me. Instead, she said the words that would haunt me for the next 2 years. Maybe it's better if you don't come around for a while, until this all dies down. The neighbors are talking, and it's too hard right now." The betrayal in those words was complete. My own mother was asking me to disappear because my presence embarrassed her. "The funny thing is," Robert said, picking up his drink, "I always knew you didn't have what it takes. You always thought you were special because of your biological father's military service. But look how that turned out. Maybe military failure runs in your family." That was the line that almost broke me. Attacking my father's memory, the man who died serving his country with honor. "Don't," I said quietly. "Don't what?" Robert challenged. "Don't tell the truth? Your father died in a car accident, Philip. Nothing heroic about it. And you got kicked out of the Marines for being reckless and incompetent. Nothing heroic about that either." Brandon laughed again. "Face it, Philip. You're not the man your father was. You're not even the man you pretended to be." I looked around the room one final time, at Robert's smug satisfaction, at Brandon's cruel enjoyment, at my mother's refusal to meet my eyes, and I understood something fundamental about my situation. And in that moment, I made a promise to myself. I would remember every word, every insult, every moment of cruelty. And someday, when the truth finally came out, I would make sure they remembered them too. The dishonorably discharged stepson, living in a studio apartment, unemployed and unemployable, was exactly what they'd always expected me to become. For 2 years, they treated my disgrace as confirmation of their superiority. Robert made jokes about my fall from grace. Brandon used my failure as a cautionary tale in his own military career. My mother distanced herself to protect the family's reputation. What none of them knew was that every insult, every rejection, every moment of cruelty was being carefully documented by someone who'd learned patience from the best teachers possible. The people who'd spent 15 years underestimating him. Because you see, the Hancock family had their own secrets, and a disgraced Marine with nothing left to lose and everything to gain was exactly the right person to expose them. My stepdad's company, Robert's construction empire, wasn't built on hard work and business acumen. It was built on stolen valor and government fraud. Brandon's rapid military advancement wasn't due to exceptional service. It was due to connections, corruption, and eventually treason. And I'd been watching, waiting, gathering evidence. For 2 years while they celebrated my downfall, I'd been preparing their destruction. And the targets weren't foreign enemies or criminal networks. The targets were them. Now let me tell you about the real corruption that I'd been investigating. Because the crimes that cut deepest aren't the ones committed by strangers. They're the ones committed by family members who think they're untouchable. Robert Hancock, my stepfather, the man who'd spent 15 years reminding me that I'd never be good enough for his family name. He'd built his construction empire on what I initially thought was just good business sense and political connections. I was wrong. See, Robert had discovered early that Department of Defense contracts were incredibly lucrative, and that having military credentials was almost essential for winning them. The problem was, he'd never served a day in uniform. His solution was elegant in its simplicity. He'd simply claim that he had. Robert had been telling potential clients stories about his own military service for over a decade. Purple Heart from Vietnam, Bronze Star from Iraq. Combat experience that sounded remarkably familiar because he'd stolen them from my biological father's service record, from his own father's stories, and from military records he'd illegally accessed through his government connections. But here's the thing about stolen valor. It's not just lying for money. It's theft of honor for men who bled for it. Every time Robert shook hands on $1 million contract using fabricated war stories, he was spitting on every real veteran's sacrifice. And I'd been documenting it for years. Every conversation where he'd claimed combat experience he'd never had. Every client meeting where he'd displayed medals he'd never earned. Every government contract he'd won by fraudulently claiming veteran status. I had recordings, photographs, financial records showing the direct correlation between his stolen valor claims and his business success. Then there was Brandon, my stepbrother. The golden child who'd never had to work for anything in his life because daddy's money and connections smoothed every path. His military career was supposed to be different. A chance for him to finally earn something on his own merit. Instead, it became the vehicle for the family's most devastating betrayal. Brandon's rapid advancement through the Air Force ranks wasn't due to exceptional service. It was due to information brokerage. He'd been selling classified intelligence to foreign operatives for 3 years, using his security clearance and access to fund a lifestyle that went far beyond a junior officer's salary. The irony was perfect. While I was being court-martialed for a mission that had actually succeeded, Brandon was committing actual treason and being promoted for it. But here's where my stepfamily's cruelty became their downfall. They thought my disgrace made me invisible. They talked freely around the failed stepson. They trusted me with information because they assumed I was too broken and desperate to be a threat. They were wrong. Every family dinner where Brandon bragged about his latest promotion, I was memorizing details. Every business meeting Robert held at the house, I was taking notes. Every cruel comment about my worthlessness, I was adding to a file that would eventually destroy them both. My mother's betrayal was different, but equally devastating. After my court-martial, when I needed family support more than ever, she made a choice that revealed exactly where her loyalties lay. Robert convinced her that supporting me publicly would hurt his business reputation. That associating with a disgraced Marine would cost them socially and financially. The smart thing to do was distance the family from my scandal until it blew over. My own mother chose her husband's business interests over her son's emotional survival. For 2 years, I watched her follow Robert's guidance like scripture. She'd cancel plans when I was included. She'd avoid mentioning me in social situations. She'd post family photos on social media that I wasn't invited to be in, standing proudly next to Brandon in his uniform while her actual son lived in exile. The woman who'd once told me I could be anything I wanted to be couldn't even acknowledge me at family gatherings. But here's what Robert and Brandon didn't know. I hadn't just been documenting their crimes. I'd been recruited to investigate them. Military intelligence had been tracking the espionage network that Brandon was feeding information to. They'd been monitoring the stolen valor fraud that Robert was perpetrating. What they needed was someone with inside access, someone the targets would never suspect, someone with both the skills and the motivation to gather evidence. A disgraced stepson with nothing left to lose was perfect. One night, they called me for a family dinner, but when my phone rang during dinner, I saw the fear flicker across Robert's face. Not confusion, fear. Because somewhere deep down, he knew that his empire was built on lies, and lies eventually get exposed. I stepped outside to take the call, and for the first time in 2 years, I dropped the broken persona I'd been maintaining. "Colonel Harrison," I said, my posture straightening automatically. "Operation Nightfall is complete. Both targets have incriminated themselves thoroughly. We have everything we need for prosecution." "Excellent work, General Morales. The President wants to personally thank you for your sacrifice. Maintaining deep cover within your own family for 2 years while gathering evidence of treason and fraud required extraordinary dedication to duty." When I walked back into that dining room, something fundamental had shifted. My mother was staring at me like she was seeing a stranger. Brandon looked confused and slightly afraid. Robert was sweating despite the air conditioning. "I have to report for duty tomorrow," I announced to the table, my voice carrying an authority that hadn't been there 10 minutes earlier. Robert laughed, but it sounded forced. "What fantasy are you living in now, Philip? You got kicked out of the military, remember? There's no duty for you to report to." I looked him directly in the eyes and smiled. Not the broken smile of a man who'd lost everything, but the calculated smile of someone who'd been playing chess while everyone else was playing checkers. "You're right, stepfather. There is no duty for Philip Morales, the disgraced ex-Marine, But there's plenty of duty for General Morales, and tomorrow morning, I'm going to watch you pay for every crime you've committed." The silence that followed wasn't confusion anymore. It was the sound of three people realizing that the family scapegoat had just become their worst nightmare. Have you ever been so underestimated by people? Share your experience in the comments, because what happened next was a result of my strategic patience against the people who underestimated me. The phone call wasn't the beginning of my vindication. It was the end of the longest undercover operation in my family's history. And the targets weren't foreign enemies. The targets were the people who'd made my life hell for thinking they were untouchable. The second phone call came during dessert, just as my mother was serving Robert's favorite pecan pie, the same dessert she used to make for my biological father before he died. This time, I didn't step outside. The phone rang with that same authoritative tone, cutting through the awkward silence that had settled over the table since my announcement about reporting for duty. 3 pairs of eyes watched me as I calmly reached for my phone, and this time, I did something that would change everything. I put it on speaker. "General Morales," the voice said, crisp and clear enough for everyone at the table to hear. "This is Secretary Davidson's office. The secretary wanted to personally confirm your briefing tomorrow at 0800. Operation Nightfall has been a complete success, and he's eager to discuss your next assignment. General Morales." I watched Robert's fork freeze halfway to his mouth. Brandon's face went completely white. My mother's hand flew to her chest like she'd been struck. "Thank you," I replied, my voice steady and professional. "Please inform the secretary that both primary targets have been thoroughly compromised. Robert Hancock's stolen valor fraud and government contract manipulation have been fully documented. Brandon Hancock's sale of classified information to foreign operatives has been completely mapped. We have sufficient evidence for prosecution." "Excellent, sir. The President sends his personal congratulations on maintaining your cover for 2 years within hostile territory. Very few officers could have sustained that level of operational security under such personal cost." Hostile territory. That's exactly what this house had been for me. I ended the call and placed the phone gently on the table, right next to those discharge papers that Robert had thrown at me an hour earlier, the same papers that had been the source of so much family shame. The silence stretched for what felt like an eternity before Brandon finally found his voice. "General?" he whispered, like he was afraid to say the word too loud. I looked at each of them, really looked at them, and for the first time in 15 years, I saw something other than condescension and contempt in their eyes. I saw terror, raw, unfiltered terror. "I need to explain something to you," I said, my voice carrying the weight of 2 years of forced silence. "And I need you to understand that what I'm about to tell you is classified at the highest levels of government. The only reason I can share this now is because the operation is complete." My mother leaned forward, her eyes wide, with a mixture of hope and horror. The court-martial was a theater. The discharge was fabricated. The media coverage was carefully orchestrated. Philip Morales, the disgraced Marine captain, never existed. He was a character I was ordered to play by the highest levels of military intelligence. Robert's face was cycling through emotions so fast I could barely track them. That's impossible." "Is it?" I asked, reaching into my jacket and pulling out a leather folder I'd been carrying for 2 years. "Is it impossible that a force reconnaissance officer with top-secret clearance and a proven track record in psychological operations might be recruited for something bigger than conventional warfare?" I opened the folder and spread its contents across the table. Official documents bearing seals they'd never seen before. Photographs of me in uniform with ribbons and decorations that weren't in any public record. A promotion certificate dated 3 months before my supposed court-martial, promoting Captain Philip Morales to the rank of Brigadier General. Operation Red Sand wasn't a failure, I continued, watching their faces as the truth began to sink in. It was a psychological operation designed to identify domestic threats to national security, military personnel and civilians who were exploiting their access to classified information and government contracts. Brandon was shaking his head slowly, like he could make the words stop being true through sheer force of will. The court-martial was designed to destroy my credibility so thoroughly that criminal networks would feel safe operating around me. A disgraced stepson with family problems and financial struggles? Perfect surveillance target for investigating family-based criminal enterprises. I pulled out another document, a thick file with photographs and financial records. For 2 years, I've been living as Philip Morales, the failure, the disappointment, the family disgrace who couldn't get a job because of his dishonorable discharge. And during those 2 years, I documented every crime committed by members of this household. My mother's hand was covering her mouth now, tears starting to stream down her cheeks. Every family dinner where classified information was discussed. Every business meeting where stolen valor was used to defraud the government. Every bank transfer from foreign intelligence services. I recorded it all. I looked directly at Robert, and I let him see something in my eyes that had been hidden for 24 months. Not the broken desperation of a failed stepson, but the cold calculation of a federal agent who'd finally completed his mission. Every night I went to bed in that studio apartment, I was receiving encrypted briefings about ongoing counterintelligence operations. Every morning, I woke up pretending to be unemployed. I was actually coordinating with federal agencies to dismantle the largest family-based espionage and fraud ring in recent history. The weight of what I was saying was finally hitting them. Brandon looked like he was going to be sick. The mission in Afghanistan, the one that supposedly went wrong, it was a complete success. We identified the entire network of military personnel who were selling classified information. Brandon's name was on that list. He'd been under surveillance for 18 months before I ever came home in disgrace. But then I delivered the blow that would destroy Robert completely. And your stolen valor, stepfather? We've been tracking your fraudulent government contracts for 3 years. Every Purple Heart you claimed, every Bronze Star you never earned, every veteran preference you stole from actual warriors. The Department of Justice has a file on you thick enough to choke a horse. I pulled out one final document, a surveillance photo of Robert meeting with a Department of Defense contracting officer. This photo was taken 6 months ago. You were handing him an envelope containing $50,000 in cash to ensure your company wins the Fort Bragg renovation contract. That's bribery of a federal official, conspiracy to commit fraud, and theft of services designated for legitimate veteran-owned businesses. Robert's construction empire, built on lies, stolen honor, and federal crimes, was about to crumble in a single day. The silence that followed was different from any that had come before. This wasn't confusion or shock. This was the sound of 3 people realizing that they had spent 2 years gloating over the downfall of someone who'd been systematically documenting their destruction. Robert was the first to speak, his voice barely above a whisper. "Philip, General, you have to understand. We're family." I looked at him with eyes that had seen things he couldn't imagine, survived betrayals he'd never comprehend, and maintained a level of operational discipline that had cost me everything I cared about. "Family?" I said simply. "You spent 15 years reminding me that I wasn't really family, that I didn't belong, that I'd never be good enough for the Hancock name. Well, congratulations, you were right. I was never really a Hancock." I stood up slowly, and for the first time in my life, I towered over the man who'd made me feel small for so many years. I was always a Morales, and tomorrow morning, the world is going to learn exactly what that means. The siren started wailing in the distance just as I finished explaining the full scope of Operation Nightfall. 3 vehicles approaching from different directions, their red and blue lights painting our dining room windows like a kaleidoscope of justice. I sat back in my chair, completely calm, while my stepfamily's world collapsed around them. You called me a failure, I said, my voice cold and measured, hiding the deep satisfaction that had been building for 15 years. You called me worthless. You said I'd never amount to anything. But the truth is, you were the real criminals all along. Robert was frantically trying to call someone on his phone, but it kept going straight to voicemail. His business partners, his lawyers, his contacts at the Department of Defense. None of them were answering because they'd all been arrested 3 hours ago. Brandon's phone buzzed with a text message. His hands were shaking so badly he could barely read it, but when he did, the color drained from his face completely. Report immediately for questioning regarding charges of treason, espionage, and conspiracy to commit fraud against the United States government. I watched him read those words, and for a moment, I felt the satisfaction I'd been waiting 15 years to experience. The stepbrother who treated me like garbage his entire life was about to learn what real consequences looked like. "How long have you known?" Brandon whispered, his voice breaking. "About your deal with Chinese intelligence?" 18 months. "About you selling flight patterns and base security protocols?" 14 months. "About you using Daddy's connections to access classified information you had no business seeing?" 1 year, 2 months, and 6 days. I pulled out a thick manila folder and spread its contents across the table. Bank statements showing wire transfers from shell companies, photographs of Brandon meeting with known foreign operatives, audio recordings of conversations where he discussed selling military secrets. Every promotion you received through nepotism and corruption gave you access to more classified information, and every piece of classified information you sold was carefully monitored and documented by federal agents. You didn't just betray your country, Brandon. You used your stepbrother's supposed disgrace as cover for treason. His Air Force dress blues, the same uniform he'd worn so smugly to family dinners while I sat there in civilian clothes, suddenly looked like a costume on a man who'd never understood what it meant to wear it. The first FBI vehicle pulled into the driveway. Robert was still trying to process what was happening. "Philip, you have to understand, the business contracts, the military stories, it was just stolen valor." I interrupted. "Federal crime. Fraud against the United States government. Using my dead father's sacrifice to profit while his son was being destroyed for actually serving his country." I opened another folder, this one containing 2 years' worth of investigation into Robert's business practices. Every contract you won using fabricated military credentials. Every story you told about combat experience you never had. Every Purple Heart and Bronze Star you claimed that belonged to better men who earned them in blood. I documented all of it. The second FBI vehicle arrived. "But here's what really destroys me," I continued, my voice finally showing the emotion I'd been hiding. "You didn't just steal valor from strangers, you stole it from my father. You used Miguel Morales' sacrifice, the man whose son you tormented for 15 years, to build your fortune while destroying that son's life." Robert's empire was about to crumble, and this time, there would be no stepson to blame for the family's disgrace. But the hardest part was still to come. My mother was sitting in stunned silence, tears streaming down her face as she watched her world reshape itself around truths she'd never imagined. For 2 years, she'd chosen Robert's practical advice over her son's emotional survival. For 15 years, she'd chosen her new family's comfort over her first son's well-being. "Mom," I said softly, and the word felt foreign after so many months of distance between us. She looked up at me with eyes full of devastation and recognition. "I need you to understand something. For 15 years, I watched you choose them over me. I watched you let Robert treat your son like garbage because it was easier than fighting for me. I watched you prioritize their happiness over mine because you were afraid of losing your financial security." Her sob was barely audible. "I couldn't tell you the truth because operational security meant more than my personal pain. But you could have trusted me. You could have believed that the son you raised alone for 10 years, the boy who promised his dying father he'd always make you proud, wouldn't have thrown away everything he cared about through stupidity. The third FBI vehicle pulled up as Brandon was led out in handcuffs. He looked back at me through the window, and I saw something in his eyes I'd been waiting 15 years to see. Not the smug superiority of the favored son, but the terror of someone who'd finally realized that actions have consequences. If you've stayed with me this long, don't forget to hit the subscribe button, because what I'm about to tell you next will change how you think about justice, patience, and what it really means to honor your family's legacy. Robert was next. As federal agents read him his rights for stolen valor, fraud, conspiracy, and bribery, he looked at me with a mixture of fear and desperate hope. "Philip, we're family. You have to help me. Think about your mother. I don't have to do anything for you," I said, standing up for the first time since dinner began. In my civilian clothes, with my father's military bearing, I suddenly looked exactly like what I was. A general who'd sacrificed everything to serve his country and protect its honor. You used my father's sacrifice to build your fortune. You tormented his son for 15 years while profiting from his memory. You spent 2 years calling me a failure while you were the real criminal. The only thing I have to do is watch justice finally being served. But my mother was different. As the chaos of arrests and sirens swirled around us, she remained at the table, staring at my father's bronze star that I'd placed there during my explanation. She'd been looking at it like it held all the answers to questions she'd never known to ask. "I failed you," she whispered. "Yes," I said simply. "You did. I chose them over you. I let them hurt you. I abandoned my son to protect my marriage." "Yes," I repeated. "Can you ever forgive me?" That was the question I'd been dreading for 15 years. The question that would determine whether we had any relationship worth salvaging. I looked at my mother, really looked at her, and saw not the woman who'd abandoned me, but the woman who'd raised me alone after my father died. The woman who'd been so terrified of losing another provider that she'd sacrificed her son's happiness for her own security. I reached into my jacket and pulled out my father's bronze star. The same medal Robert had been claiming in his stolen valor stories. The same medal that represented everything my real family stood for. "This belonged to Dad," I said, placing it gently in her hands. "Miguel Morales earned it in Iraq. He was proud of it, and he was proud of his son, even though he never got to see what that son would become." Her hands closed around the medal like it was a lifeline. "I'm leaving tonight," I continued. "New assignment, new mission. I'll be gone for at least 2 years, maybe longer. When I come back, if you want to try to rebuild what we lost, we can talk. But it will be as Morales, not as Hancock's. And it will be on the understanding that you chose wrong for 15 years. I leaned down and kissed her forehead. At the first physical contact we'd had in over a year. "I forgive you, Mom. But forgiveness doesn't erase consequences. It just means we can move forward despite them." 24 hours later, I stood at my father's grave in my dress uniform, wearing the stars of a general for the first time in public. The headstone was simple. Miguel Morales, United States Marine, Bronze Star recipient, devoted father. But now I could add something that had been missing for 24 years, father of General Philip Morales. The media was calling it the largest domestic counterintelligence victory of the decade. 23 arrests, 2 foreign intelligence networks dismantled, millions in fraudulent contracts recovered. Brandon was facing life in prison for treason. Robert's empire was in ruins, and he was facing decades in federal prison. But standing there at my father's grave, none of that mattered as much as the simple truth I could finally speak out loud. "I did it, Dad. I served with honor. I protected our country. I upheld the Morales legacy. And I did it all while the people who should have supported me tried to destroy me." The morning sun was rising over the cemetery, painting the headstones gold, and for the first time in 15 years, I felt truly free. Here's what I learned from this experience, and here's what I want you to remember. Family isn't about blood or marriage certificates. It's about honor, loyalty, and sacrifice. The people who spend years telling you that you're not good enough, not worthy, not really family, they're usually projecting their own insecurities and failures onto you. My stepfamily called me a failure while I was serving at the highest levels of military intelligence. They chose appearance over substance, comfort over character, greed over honor. But in the end, patient planning and unwavering principle defeated their corruption and cruelty. If you enjoyed this story, like, subscribe, and share with others so they can learn too. See you in our next video.